Hello guys and welcome back to our channel. I welcome you to a journey through a hidden chapter of American history, one that reveals the brutal reality of life for Black Americans during the Jim Crow era. Now in this video, Professor Moore is back with another powerful book recommendation that sheds light on the daily terror and violence faced by Black people on segregated buses in the South. Now, you may know the story of Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus in 1955, leading to the civil rights movement. But have you ever heard of Viola White, a 35-year-old woman who did the exact same thing a decade earlier, only to face a horrific fate? Now, in 1944, Viola White was beaten, arrested, and fined for refusing to give up her seat to a palm-colored person on a segregated bus in Alabama. But that was only the beginning. When she dared to appeal the verdict, the police retaliated in a shocking display of brutality, kidnapping and raping her 16-year-old daughter. Now, this is just one of the many stories that historian Margaret Burnham shares in her book, The Hands Now Known Jim Crow's Legal Executioners. Now, this book is a game changer, offering a searing indictment of the systemic racism and violence that was perpetrated against Black Americans during the Jim Crow era. Now, as Professor Moore notes, this book is a must-read for anyone who wants to understand the legacies of slavery and the ongoing struggle for racial justice in America. So with that said, let's get started. Let's get into this powerful video and explore the hidden history of segregated buses in Alabama. I will be right back.
Hey everybody, Professor Moore here, and I have a book recommendation for you. Margaret Burnham's By Hands Now Known, Jim Crow's Legal Executioners. This is one of the most important books that I have read in years. I honestly believe that if more people read this book, they would have a better understanding about the legacies of slavery and the daily violence that Black Americans faced during the Jim Crow era, which lasted from the 1870s to the 1960s. One area that the book covers is the daily terror and violence that Black Americans faced on segregated buses in the South. Now, most of us probably know the name Rosa Parks. We know the story of how in 1955, she refused to give up her seat to a white person on a segregated bus, and this started the Montgomery bus boycott in Alabama and really helped to kickstart the civil rights movement. But how many of us know the name Viola White? A decade before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus, a 35-year-old Black woman named Viola White did exactly the same thing, but her story ended very differently. After refusing to give up her seat to a white person on a segregated bus in Alabama in 1944, Viola White was beaten, arrested, and fined $10. After Viola White was found guilty, she decided to appeal the verdict, and that's when the police decided to retaliate against her. In an effort to tear Viola White and to get her to drop her appeal, a police officer, her 16-year-old daughter, and raped her. Viola White was able to take down that police officer's license plate, but when she reported it to the police department, they simply tipped off that officer who left town, and he was never charged with a crime. This is the terrorism that Black Americans faced for simply trying to use public transportation. In her book, Margaret Burnham notes that it was not unusual for Black riders to be beaten in plain sight of other riders by bus drivers, white passengers, and the police. In the same year that Viola White was arrested, another Black woman named Mary White was attacked on a segregated bus in Alabama. One of the most humiliating aspects of riding these buses is that Black passengers were not allowed to go in through the front. They had to enter the bus through the back door. When a bus driver refused to allow Mary White to go in through the front entrance, she called him a son of... And for that comment, the bus driver picked up a fire extinguisher and beat her over the head with it. This was the danger of defying the racist rules of segregated buses, but the punishment could be much worse. The punishment often was... One of the main groups who challenged these white supremacist rules on segregated buses were Black soldiers and veterans. They felt that by serving their country during the Second World War, they did not deserve to be treated like second-class citizens. They felt that by serving their country, they at least deserved to be treated like human beings. One Black soldier who was stationed in the South described the daily racism that he experienced. He said, "To be a Black soldier in the South was one of the worst things that could happen to you. If you go to town, you would have to get off the sidewalk if a white person came by. If you went into the wrong neighborhood wearing your uniform, you got beat up. If off post you were hungry and couldn't find a black restaurant or a black home, you would starve. And you were a soldier out there wearing the uniform of your country and you're getting treated like a dog. That happened all over the South. For standing up against Southern, many black soldiers and veterans were in broad daylight by bus drivers and cops. In her book, Margaret Burnham tells us that between 1941 and 1946, at least 28 active duty black soldiers lost their lives in the United States for refusing to submit silently to the humiliations of Jim Crow. One of these black soldiers who lost their lives was named Henry Williams. On August 15, 1942, Henry Williams got on a segregated bus in Mobile, Alabama. The white bus driver, Grover Chandler, decided to stop the bus to talk to a friend. When Williams asked the bus driver Chandler to hurry up his conversation because he had to get back to his military base on time, the bus driver pulled out his revolver and began beating Williams over the head with it. When Williams got off the bus, Chandler chased him down and hit him in the back of the head instantly. The bus driver, Grover Chandler, was never charged with a crime, and the U.S. Army never made any effort to find justice for their slain soldier. Williams was buried in an unmarked grave. Grover Chandler, lived a long, happy life and peacefully in 1981. If we read the obituary, we learn that he was a lifelong member of the Fellowship Baptist Church. Another black soldier who was on a segregated bus was Booker T. Spicely. Spicely got on a bus in Durham, North Carolina in 1944. When the bus driver, Herman Lee Council, forced Spicely to get up out of his seat to make room for a white passenger, Spicely responded, "I thought I was fighting this war for democracy. I'm from Pennsylvania. I'm not used to seeing things like this." When Spicely got off the bus, the driver chased him down and shot him twice in the heart and in the stomach. When the police arrived, they took Spicely to the Watts Hospital. However, they refused to admit him because he was black. When Spicely finally got to a hospital that would treat black people, he was already dead. The bus driver, Herman Lee Council, was tried for manslaughter. However, during the trial, the driver falsely claimed that Spicely had his hands in his pockets and he feared for his life. After 2 days of testimony and only 30 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned a not guilty verdict to a segregated courtroom. The U.S. Army conducted their own investigation, but they did not investigate They investigated black soldiers and the black community to make sure that no one was going to protest. That's how much they cared about the lives of their black soldiers. 2 years after Spicely was killed, a black Army veteran named Timothy Hood was murdered in Bessemer, Alabama. Timothy Hood got on a segregated bus, and he made the mistake of moving the color board to allow more room for black passengers to sit down. As he did this, he told the bus driver, "Where I just came from, us colored had all the seat room we wanted. We sat anywhere we wanted to." For making this comment and moving that color board, the bus driver, William Ryan Weeks, Timothy Hood 5 times. When the police arrived, they didn't arrest the bus driver, they arrested Timothy Hood. The police chief, Greenberry Fant, handcuffed Hood and put him in the back of his police car. He then proceeded to interrogate Hood and asked him if he had done anything to make the bus driver fear for his life. When Timothy Hood, who had just been 5 times, refused to answer this police officer's questions, he pulled out his gun and him right there in his car. Once again, no one was charged with the crime of murder. Not the bus driver, not the police officer. It was without consequence, because in a white supremacist world, black life does not matter. This is how dehumanized black Americans were a mere 78 years ago. They were treated as second-class citizens. Their lives did not matter. In her book, Margaret Burnham argues that there needs to be reparations for the victims of Jim Crow violence, just as there needs to be reparations for the victims of slavery. Burnham tells us that reparation is an interdependent bundle of gestures and practices that involve recognition, truth-telling, apology, and payment, owed to all the victims of Jim Crow injustice. Indeed, the enduring presence of slavery in American structures and institutions militates in favor of reparations, both to address the wounds of enslavement and to dismantle systemic racism. She also notes that their claims for reparations should be promptly addressed because the generation most affected by these crimes is aging. This is not ancient history. This is practically yesterday. This is not Black history. This is American history. And if we ever want to move forward, this violence has to be acknowledged and addressed in a meaningful way.
Now, after listening to Professor Moore's video, I'm left with a question. Like, how many Black people were unalive during the segregated bus era in America? The numbers that we do know are staggering, but I fear that they only scratch the surface of the true extent of the violence and terror that was inflicted upon Black people. From the few cases that Professor Moore mentioned, it's very clear that the unalivings were not isolated incidents, but rather a systemic pattern of violence that was perpetrated against Black people. The fact that Viola White, a 35-year-old woman, was beaten, arrested, and fined for refusing to give up her seat on a segregated bus, and that her 16-year-old daughter was kidnapped and raped by a police officer is a harrowing example of the brutality that Black people faced. But what about the countless others who suffered similar fates? What about the Black people who were unalive, beaten, or terrorized on buses, trains, and other public transportation? What about those who were unalived, pew-pewed, or brutalized by palm-color mobs and police officers? The numbers are likely staggering, but they may never be fully known. It's estimated that between 1882 and 1968, over 4,700 people were unalived in the United States, with the vast majority being Black. But this number only accounts for documented cases, and it's likely that many more were unalived without being recorded. The numbers don't capture the full scope of the violence and terror that Black people faced, including beatings, arrests, and other forms of intimidation. The lack of documentation and accountability is a testament to the systemic racism that perpetrated these atrocities. It's a reminder that the lives of Black people were not valued, and that their unalivings were often ignored or covered up. Now, as I reflect on Professor Moore's video, I'm left with a sense of outrage and sadness. I'm outraged that these atrocities were committed and that they were allowed to continue for so long. I'm saddened by the loss of life and by the fact that many of these cases may never be fully known or documented. Now, this dark legacy of the segregated bus era in America is really a painful reminder of the systemic racism and violence that was perpetrated against Black people during this period. Countless Black individuals were brutally unalived by palm-color drivers and police officers, often with impunity. The sheer number of their lives lost is staggering, and the fact that none of the perpetrators were held accountable for their crimes is a travesty of justice. It's really appalling to think that Black people who were simply trying to ride the bus to work, school, or other destinations were subjected to such violence and terror. The fact that palm-color drivers and police officers felt emboldened to take the lives of Black people with no fear of consequences is an illustration of the deep-seated racism that pervaded American society. Still does, actually. But what's even more egregious is that when Black people were unalived or brutalized, it was often the victims who were blamed and punished. The palm-color perpetrators were rarely, if ever, charged with unaliving or any other crime. Instead, the Black community was subjected to further harassment, intimidation, and violence. Now, this was a deliberate attempt to maintain the status quo of palm-color supremacy and to crush the spirits of Black people. By denying them justice and perpetrating a culture of fear and violence, the system ensured that Black people remained subjugated and powerless. The fact that this dark chapter in American history has been largely erased from our collective memory is a testament to the power of systemic racism. It's a reminder that the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, and segregation continues to haunt us even today. Now, segregated buses were public transportation vehicles that enforced racial separation, requiring Black passengers to sit in designated areas or even stand, while palm-color passengers occupied the more desirable seats. Now, this practice was a fundamental aspect of Jim Crow laws, which institutionalized racial discrimination and segregation in the southern United States, and played a significant role in the civil rights movement as activists challenged these unjust practices. And segregation laws in Montgomery stated that when a bus was full, the Black passengers must stand and give their seat to a palm-color passenger. However, Parks refused to give up her seat and was subsequently arrested. Now, PAC's actions sparked a boycott avoidance of buses in Montgomery by the African American population. Throughout the boycott, Martin Luther King led the protests against segregation on Montgomery's bus system, and this affected the income of the bus company, as around 60 to 70% of customers had been Black Americans. Now, since the institution of Jim Crow laws at the close of the 19th century, African Americans in the South had been forced to endure substandard segregated conditions while traveling on railways and buses. Now, blacks were forced to sit in the back of the bus and forced to use separate waiting rooms, drinking fountains, and restrooms. In addition to the humiliation of segregated facilities, the threat of violence was always present for black travelers. Now, you didn't know what you were going to encounter, said freedom rider Charles Person. You had night riders who had hoodlums. You could be antagonized at any point in your journey. Most of the time, it was very, very difficult to plan a trip. Now, on July 16, 1944, Irene Morgan was arrested by the sheriff Middlesex County, Virginia, after refusing to give up her seat on a Greyhound bus while traveling home from Baltimore. Now, the legal staff of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, took up her case, and on June 3, 1946, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in her favor, striking down racial segregation on interstate buses as a violation of the Interstate Commerce Clause. In December 1960, Boynton v. Virginia expanded the Morgan decision, outlawing segregated waiting rooms, lunch counters, and restroom facilities for interstate passengers. However, both rulings were largely ignored in the Deep South. Now, on September 22, 1961, after 6 months of protests, arrests, and press conferences by the Freedom Riders, the Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, finally outlawed discriminatory seating practices and interstate bus transit and ordered the removal of Pam-colored people only signs from interstate bus terminals by November 1st. Activists vowed to step up the pressure to enforce the ruling, while pockets of RTC's resistance persisted for several years. Even segregationist Birmingham AL had conceded the issue by January 1962. Now, the period of segregation and racial terror in America was a very, very dark and painful chapter in the history of Black Americans. The stories of Viola White, Rosa Parks, and countless others who suffered at the hands of Pam-color supremacists are a testament to the brutal and inhumane treatment that Black people endured. Despite the overwhelming evidence of the harm and trauma inflicted upon Black Americans during this period, the issue of reparations remains a contentious and deeply divisive topic. It is astonishing that to this day, many Pam-color Americans refuse to acknowledge the debt that is owed to Black people for the centuries of slavery, segregation, and systemic racism that they endured. The fact that reparations are still a hard topic for some Pam-color Americans to discuss and accept is really a reminder of the deep-seated racism and privilege that continues to pervade American society. It is a testament to the ways in which Pam-color Americans have been socialized to believe that they are not responsible for the harm that their ancestors inflicted upon Black people and that they do not owe anything to the descendants of enslaved people. But the truth is that reparations are not just a moral imperative, but a necessary step towards healing. Reparations are not just about paying monetary compensation to Black people, but about acknowledging the harm that was done and taking concrete steps to address the ongoing disparities and inequalities that Black people face. Now, the refusal of Pam-color Americans to pay reparations is not just a refusal to acknowledge the past, but a refusal to acknowledge the present-day consequences of that past. It is a refusal to acknowledge that the wealth and privilege that many Pam-color Americans enjoy today is built on the backs of enslaved people and the generations of Black people who were denied access to education, housing, and economic opportunities. Until Pam-color Americans are willing to confront that truth of their history and take responsibility for the harm that was inflicted upon Black people, we will not be able to move forward towards a more just and equitable society. Reparations are not just a moral obligation, but a necessary step. We have finally come to the end of the video, but what do you, our viewers, have to say? Share your thoughts, your views as well in the comment section. Thank you for always watching, and see you in our next video as we bring you another interesting video.